In the early days of the UFC, one man terrified everyone, not because of technique, but because of chaos. Tank Abbott wasn't polished, he wasn't pretty, but when he stepped into the cage, it was like watching a bar fight erupt in a coliseum. Now, he can't walk without help. His heart nearly gave out. His body is failing, but his spirit still swinging. This is the brutal, tragic, and unbelievable fall of Tank Abbott. And it all started with a fistfight in Huntington Beach. In the earliest days of the UFC, where rules were few and gloves were optional, there emerged a fighter who didn't fit the mold of a trained martial artist. He smashed it. David Tank Abbott burst onto the scene, not with belts or black GIs, but with beer belly bravado, street fight scars, and a look that screamed chaos. While Brazilian jiu-jitsu specialists like Royce Gracie were demonstrating the beauty of technique, Tank was offering raw violence. No frills, just fists. Tank came from Huntington Beach, California, and he was more at home in a dive bar than a dojo. With a background in wrestling and a talent for fighting outside of sanctioned rings, he was already a legend before ever stepping foot in the UFC. In 1995, he made his UFC debut at UFC 6, knocking out John Matua in a terrifying display that felt more like a prison riot than a sporting contest. He didn't just knock Matua out, he mocked him while he convulsed on the ground. It was ugly and unforgettable. Fans either loved him or feared him, sometimes both. Tank brought something the UFC hadn't seen yet: unpredictability. He wasn't calculating like Ken Shamrock, he wasn't cerebral like Gracie. He was a force of nature, a barroom brawler in a world trying to become a sport. That made him dangerous. That made him iconic. He kept coming back, fight after fight, even when he lost. And he did lose. But in an era where spectacle was as important as skill, Tank never stopped being a draw. His fights were unpredictable and wild, like when he nearly defeated Don Fry, or when he destroyed Steve Nelmark so badly that the man's legs folded underneath him like a rag doll. But while fans roared and Tank flexed for cameras, there was something festering behind the curtain: the weight cuts, the drinking, the lack of recovery. Tank lived like he fought, fast, reckless, and always one punch away from collapse. Yet the UFC loved him for it. They knew Tank could be counted on to bring chaos, and for a while, that was enough to keep him relevant. But the sport was evolving, and chaos alone doesn't age well. As MMA matured into a professional sport, Tank Abbott stayed stuck in time. He didn't evolve with the new wave of fighters. Where others trained in all disciplines, striking, submissions, cardio, Tank stuck to what he knew: raw power and wild fists. The UFC eventually moved past him. Younger, leaner, more technical fighters pushed him out of title contention. And Tank didn't care. He fought for pride, not belts. But that pride started to backfire. He began taking fights he had no business accepting, underprepared, out of shape, and visibly deteriorating. One of his most infamous late-career performances was against Kimbo Slice. Promoted as a clash of street-fighting titans, it ended with Tank getting brutalized in under a minute. The crowd jeered, but Tank walked away with a smile. Or maybe it was just him hiding the shame. The losses piled up, but the damage was worse. Tank took real punishment. In an era where medical suspensions were loose and recovery protocols were almost non-existent, he kept stepping back into the cage with busted knees, damaged ribs, and a growing addiction to painkillers and booze. Outside of fighting, his personal life mirrored his career: reckless. Stories surfaced of bar altercations, lawsuits, burned bridges with promoters, and general self-destruction. Tank's persona wasn't an act. It was him, fully. And it took a toll. He was offered commentary gigs and reality TV stints, but none stuck. He lacked the polish. He didn't want to play the corporate game. So instead, he leaned harder into being Tank Abbott, a relic, a wild man, a throwback. But deep down, even he had to feel it. The world was moving on. UFC was now a billion-dollar brand. Fighters were polished, strategic, and Instagram-ready. Tank was none of those things. He was a man out of time. And while the world watched Conor McGregor and John Jones, Tank Abbott was vanishing, not all at once, but piece by piece. Then came the fall, not in the cage, but in real life. Years of alcohol abuse, weight fluctuation, head trauma, and stress finally caught up to Tank in the most brutal way possible. In 2018, he was diagnosed with end-stage heart failure. Doctors told him flat out he had only months to live. His heart was shutting down, and his body was too damaged for a simple fix. 6. Tank's fans had seen him eat punches that would flatten other men. They'd watched him laugh through losses and limp away from war. But nothing prepared them for the images that came next. Tank in a hospital bed, skeletal and swollen, hooked to machines, his eyes barely open. He needed a new heart, and fast. But there was a problem: his history. Years of heavy drinking and chaotic living made him a risky candidate. Transplant boards don't just look at vitals, they look at behavior. Tank wasn't an ideal recipient. He admitted later that he had to change everything just to get on the list. Sober up, lose weight, prove he wanted to live, not fight, just live. He was no longer battling opponents. He was battling time. After weeks in the ICU and a long wait, Tank Abbott received a heart transplant. It saved his life. But the man who walked out of that hospital wasn't the same one who walked into the octagon years before. He had lost over 100 pounds. His muscles were gone. His face looked hollow. And worst of all, he couldn't walk unassisted. Tank, the human wrecking ball, was now the guy leaning on nurses to make it to the bathroom. The man who once laughed at pain was now crying quietly through rehab. The guy who mocked weakness now depended on others just to get out of bed. And though he survived, something else had died. The invincible image, the unstoppable brawler, the man who couldn't be killed, now had to relearn how to live. Tank Abbott didn't walk out of the hospital a triumphant survivor. He shuffled, slowly, carefully. Every movement reminded him that the price for living was now paid in pain. The brawler who once knocked men unconscious with a single punch couldn't even take 10 steps without holding onto a wall. His body, once a symbol of raw aggression and chaos, had become a cage of its own, thin, weakened, alien to the man who once flaunted his brute strength. Recovery wasn't quick, it wasn't clean. Tank entered physical rehab with a mixture of pride and humiliation. Nurses knew his name, not because they were fans, but because he was the patient who needed extra help just to make it to the bathroom. Every day became a struggle to reclaim a fraction of what he'd lost. He was learning to stand without help, then walk, then, hopefully, live without fear that his heart would fail again. In interviews, he tried to laugh it off. He still threw around the same bravado. "I'm too tough to die," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. But when he sat back in that hospital chair, breathing heavily, you could see it. He knew things had changed permanently. He knew this wasn't a comeback story. There was no second wind, only borrowed time. Tank's speech had slowed. His memory drifted. At times, he'd mix up fight dates or forget names mid-sentence. Decades of head trauma had begun to show. The toll wasn't just physical, it was mental. He wasn't just fighting for mobility, he was fighting to hold on to who he was. But who even was Tank Abbott? Without fists, without swagger, without chaos. What haunted him most wasn't the pain or the scars, it was the silence. The MMA world he helped build had moved on. Fighters he paved the way for barely mentioned his name. Promotions didn't call. Commentators spoke about the history of the sport and left him out. It wasn't just a physical decline, it was an erasure, and he felt it every day he looked in the mirror and saw a man no longer recognized by the sport he bled for. In a bid to stay relevant, Tank Abbott turned to something new, the podcast world. He joined forces with independent creators, appearing on MMA-themed shows where his stories became digital gold. Tank didn't pull punches, he never had, and fans who remembered the wild man from the early UFC days were drawn to hear what he had to say now, older, weaker, but still dangerous with words. The podcast appearances were raw and unfiltered. Tank would ramble through memories like old war stories. He'd talk about knocking out opponents, about almost dying, about drinking before fights, and waking up unsure who he'd fought. There was a strange pride in his voice, like a man who had survived something ancient and unspeakable. And maybe he had, but not every episode was gold. Sometimes the stories didn't make sense. Sometimes the humor came with a sharp edge of bitterness. Tank ranted about the UFC being too soft, about modern fighters being pampered, about Dana White forgetting who built the foundation. He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't entirely right either. The sport had changed, and Tank, for better or worse, hadn't. His health was impossible to ignore. Even on audio, you could hear the strain. His breathing was heavy. His sentences came slower. His energy dipped mid-interview. And while his fans rooted for him, the elephant in the room grew louder. This man was suffering, and he was still reaching for relevance, like it was oxygen. At one point, Tank even floated the idea of a return. "One last fight," he said. "Maybe against Tito, or maybe I'll take on some YouTuber." He laughed, but no one else did. Everyone knew it wasn't happening. Not with a transplanted heart, not with a body that needed help standing up. Still, the podcasts gave him something. A voice, a platform, a way to remind people that he mattered. That he wasn't just a meme or a footnote in MMA history. Tank was trying to write his own ending, but with every episode, it felt like he was pleading more with himself than the world. "Please remember me. Please don't let this be how it ends." Eventually, the podcast invites slowed. The stories dried up. The MMA news cycle rolled on. New stars, new controversies, new belts. Tank Abbott, the man who once headlined events, terrified opponents, and drew eyes with pure chaos, was now little more than a whisper among hardcores, an obscure trivia answer, a memory fading with each passing year. Tank now lived in near total isolation. No Instagram, no coaching gigs, no promotional appearances. He wasn't inducted into the UFC Hall of Fame. He wasn't featured in retrospectives. He simply vanished. The man who once walked into bars like a storm now needed help getting out of his car. The man who once mocked weakness was now at war with his own fragility. Every day was a new reminder that legacy doesn't guarantee peace, that being a pioneer doesn't mean you'll be remembered, that the sport doesn't owe you anything, not even gratitude. Tank Abbott was the type of fighter who existed before regulations, before fame, before pay-per-view records, and that meant he was also the type of fighter the industry was okay forgetting. When he spoke in rare interviews, there was pain in his words, not from the punches or the surgeries, but from the silence. "I was there," he once said. "I was part of this, but no one wants to hear from Tank anymore." He was right. The sport had moved on, and Tank was stuck watching it from the shadows. His health continued to decline. Movement became slower. Words became more jumbled. The laughter, when it came, felt tired, like a man remembering better days but knowing they'll never return. And still, no Hall of Fame call, no grand farewell. Tank Abbott, the original brawler of the UFC, was living proof of what the sport once was. And maybe that's why they buried him in silence, because remembering Tank means remembering how brutal this all really used to be. The cruel truth about time is that it doesn't wait, and for Tank Abbott, it didn't just pass him by, it steamrolled him. As the sport he helped shape polished itself into a billion-dollar industry, Tank became the grim reminder of what MMA used to be: brutal, raw, and unregulated. The UFC's transformation into a globally respected brand had no space for the man who once threw punches with beer breath and laughed as blood splattered. Tank wasn't just forgotten, he was actively buried. He was the original archetype, the brawler, the villain, the chaos. But now, he wasn't marketable, he wasn't safe, he wasn't even healthy. There was no sponsorship deal waiting for him, no memoir with a Hollywood adaptation, just silence. An eerie kind of silence that creeps in when you realize you've been erased by something you helped build. Tank never had a thank you moment. No standing ovation in the octagon. No legends panel. No honorary belt. While others with smoother tongues and safer reputations were embraced as trailblazers, Tank Abbott watched from the shadows of a rented house in Orange County, recovering from a heart transplant, battling his body every day just to stand upright. The few fans who still remembered him spoke of him like a ghost story. Remember when Tank KO'd Matua? Remember when he almost killed Nelmark? The word remember became his legacy, because that's all that was left. Memories. And even those were fading, replaced by TikTok highlight reels and sanitized documentaries that tiptoed around the dirtier names in MMA's past. Tank didn't want pity, but he deserved acknowledgement, because without guys like him, the UFC doesn't get that raw spark that caught fire in the first place. He brought in fans who didn't care about martial arts. They wanted to see violence, heart, spectacle. He gave them that. He gave all of himself to that cage. And now, that cage didn't even remember his name. Despite the silence, despite the pain, Tank Abbott kept showing up to life. He woke up every day, took his medication, went to physical therapy, and kept fighting, just not in the way people remembered. His fight now wasn't against another man. It was against his own body, against decay, against time. Doctors told him he'd likely never walk properly again, that his heart, though transplanted, was still at risk, that every day without complication was a miracle. But Tank was never good at listening to doctors. He pushed himself harder than he should have, fell more than once, got back up every time, not because he thought he'd recover fully, but because standing, walking, breathing, those were his new victories. But the emotional toll ran deeper than the physical scars. Tank had to sit with his own legend, the myth he built, the man who walked into the octagon to cheers and fear alike. Now, just a man with a scar down his chest and a walker at his side. The dissonance between who he was and who he'd become was crushing. He would look in the mirror and see someone unrecognizable, a body that betrayed him, a legacy that ignored him. And still, he didn't break. He joked in interviews, he thanked his donors, he showed up for small fan conventions when he could, signing autographs with shaky hands and a smile. Because if the industry wasn't going to honor him, at least a few people still would. A few loyal fans who remembered not just the chaos, but the heart behind it. In those quiet moments, when the cameras were gone and the lights were off, Tank Abbott was still a fighter. Not a cage fighter, not a pay-per-view brawler, but a man trying to live, trying to matter, trying to leave something behind before it was too late. The kind of fight no one sees, the kind of courage no one applauds. Tank Abbott's story isn't just a personal tragedy. It's a reflection of something bigger, something broken in the way combat sports remember their own. We celebrate champions, we promote showmen, but we abandon the pioneers. We forget the men who gave their bodies to build the foundation before there were gloves, weight classes, or medical suspensions. We turn their blood into entertainment and then turn our backs when they have nothing left to give. Tank wasn't a perfect man. He wasn't always kind or smart or polished, but he was real, brutally real. He stepped into cages knowing he'd likely leave broken, and he did it anyway, for the thrill, for the paycheck, for the crowd, for us. And now, he sits in a quiet home, flipping through channels, watching a sport he helped create, and seeing no sign he was ever there. No highlights, no tributes, no nods, just silence. Like he never mattered. Like the punches never happened. Like the chaos never came. But it did, and we remember. Not because the UFC told us to, not because some Hall of Fame plaque was unveiled, but because we saw it, we felt it. We cheered when he roared. We winced when he fell. We laughed when he mocked. We gasped when he bled. He made us feel something, and that means something. Maybe Tank Abbott will never get the ceremony. Maybe he'll never get the credit, but this story, that of a wild man who fought until his body gave out and still refused to quit, that story deserves to be told. Not to glorify the damage, but to understand the cost. Because legends aren't made in clean gyms and Instagram reels. They're forged in blood, in silence, and in pain. And Tank Abbott? He was a legend, even if no one says it out loud anymore. There's a haunting stillness that lingers when the crowd is gone, when the bright lights fade, and the gloves are hung up for the last time. Tank Abbott lives in that stillness now, not as a cautionary tale, not as a symbol of failure, but as a forgotten cornerstone of something that became too big to remember its roots. He wasn't polished. He didn't have a spotless record. He didn't train at elite gyms or cut emotional promos. But that was never the point. Tank Abbott wasn't meant to win championships. He was meant to represent the raw, unfiltered energy of a sport still figuring out what it was. And for a while, he was that energy. Chaos personified, fearless, unapologetic, real. Today, he fights a different kind of opponent, one that doesn't tap out. His heart is borrowed, his strength is fading, and the man once feared for his knockout power now leans on others just to walk across the room. His words come slower, his jokes softer, and the fire, while still there, burns behind tired eyes. And yet, Tank Abbott endures. He isn't gone. He isn't finished. And while the MMA world may no longer speak his name with the same reverence, those who truly remember know what he gave. Every scar, every drop of blood, every beat of his once failing heart, now held together by surgery and sheer will. When you think of legends, it's easy to picture belts and trophies, but that's not what Tank left behind. His legacy lives in the broken rules, the swinging fists, the wild energy that modern MMA has desperately tried to contain. His legend lives in every brawler who walks into a cage thinking brute force might be be enough. In every outsider who believes there's still room in the sport for raw power over perfect form, he didn't fit the mold, so they buried him under history. But now, you're hearing his story. So the next time you hear someone talk about the early days of the UFC, ask them about Tank Abbott. Ask them why no one brings him up anymore. And when they hesitate, remind them. Remind them that the sport they love was built on the backs of men like Tank. Men who didn't get six-figure contracts or legacy awards. Men who gave everything and got nothing in return but the bruises. This isn't just a story about decline. It's a story about what happens when fame leaves and all that's left is the damage. It's about what it means to be a warrior in a world that no longer has room for you. And it's about one man who still wakes up, still breathes, still walks, no matter how much it hurts. Tank Abbott may not headline another card. He may not sell out an arena, but his legacy isn't gone. It's just been hiding in the shadows, waiting to be remembered.